How did they want to use mice as a weapon against the Japanese during World War II? What kind of miraculous weapon of retribution did Nazi Germany almost manage to prepare? Sometimes you marvel at the insane and incredible weapons different countries invented during World War II. In this video, I'll talk about the most unusual types of weaponry. And at the end, I'll talk about how the hydrogen bomb existed and was used during the war. Some may argue that kamikazes are not weapons, but the problem is that during World War II there were no modern technologies. Today, there are various models of unmanned kamikaze drones, but back then, they simply used living people. Of course, the Japanese resorted to such tactics not out of a good life. They first used kamikaze planes with attached bombs in October 1944, when their situation became catastrophic. When the Japanese saw the positive results of such attacks, they started inventing manned winged bombs with rocket engines, manned torpedoes, and kamikaze boats. In countries where human life is worth next to nothing, such battle tactics are considered acceptable. But even they face a serious problem. Imagine you're a cynical government and don't care about lives. But the problem is that war is strict mathematics. Everything needs to be calculated. To grow a new kamikaze, at least 17 years must pass for a person to grow up and train as a pilot. This is the weak link in such cynical tactics. You may argue, why grow someone when you can use ready pilots? Well, if the war lasts one day, then it is so. But the Japanese noticed a strange phenomenon. Pilots quickly ran out. They urgently deployed a program to train new pilots, but the quality of training suffered greatly. A plane is much more complex than a sapper's shovel or a rifle. By the way, using a plane just once is also not the best solution. Its manufacturing requires time and resources, and Japan had special problems with resources. Actually, this problem pushed the Japanese against the USA. Remember, the attack on Pearl Harbor started because of an imposed embargo. Ordinary people think the main goal of war is to capture territories. In reality, capturing territories is a political goal. The military's task is to destroy the enemy's army. If this can be done without capturing territories, it's even better. No need to stretch logistics. Once the army is defeated, you can freely enter and take power. Therefore, the military always calculates everything and draws conclusions from these calculations. Exact numbers are hard to find, but approximately 3,000 kamikazes died. But don't compare them to ordinary infantrymen. It takes several years of continuous training to prepare a pilot from scratch. These are not specialists you can simply squander. If Germany had not started the war, it would likely be the most developed country in the world today, especially since it was already a leader at the beginning of the 20th century. Apart from some absurd projects, they also managed to outdo the whole world in advanced technical developments during the height of the war. And this was at a time when Allied forces dumped kilotons of bombs on German cities. If translated into TNT equivalent, about 9,000 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima were dropped on Germany. Even after the war, the victorious countries took many drawings, equipment, and German scientists from Germany. German developments were that important for the world. Today the word Wunderwaffe has become a common term, but it originated from the German Wunderwaffe, miracle weapon. Propaganda often used this name, so it has reached our times. However, in reality, they officially called their weapon Vergeltungswaffe, which literally means weapon of retribution. One type of such weapons were the V1, V2, and also V3 rockets, which were essentially an artillery weapon. To clarify, V1 and V2 are ordinary rockets flying along a ballistic trajectory, and V3 was essentially a stationary long-range mega cannon with jet projectiles designed to hit up to 100 miles away. It's a kind of mix of a cannon and modern MLRS like Grad and HIMARS. If the Allies hadn't bombed it, London would certainly have been wiped off the face of the earth. Fortunately, this was the only example the Nazis had. Why London? Simply, Hitler had a fixation on London. Instead of hitting strategic targets, a huge amount of resources and effort was spent on bombing London. This cannon couldn't be re-aimed from one target to another. It was originally built to specifically hit London. Even looking at the photo, many don't understand how it was supposed to work. But if you focus only on the long barrel and ignore the side branches, then it's easier to understand. The side branches of the centipede provided additional energy to the accelerating projectile. Regarding V1 and V2, these were indeed terrifying weapons. But for effective use of these rockets, Germany had to produce them in far greater numbers than it physically could. Although during the entire time, 3225 were launched at Britain, it turned out that this was not enough. Do you know why Porsche was acquitted in court after the war, and Renault was not? After all, both engineers helped the Third Reich in the development and construction of weapons. The super heavy tank Maus is a clear example of this. Ferdinand Porsche deliberately designed the most pointless tank in the world. He always incorporated so-called bugs in all his designs, which significantly degraded the quality of the product. This applies to the Tiger and other his developments. For instance, the Maus tank had no machine guns for close combat. It weighed so much that any muddy road turned it into pointless immobility. There was no tractor in the world that could pull such a behemoth out of the mud, forget about bridges too. Can you imagine that the Germans planned to ferry such a tank across riverbeds? Do you know many rivers with perfect bottoms, without silt, debris, and other unpleasant things? The tank's power plant was in the form of a very unreliable Daimler-Benz MB 5-Ventine diesel engine. Essentially, this engine served as a generator for electric motors, which in turn transmitted torque to the drive wheels. The tank itself was so high-tech that it was physically impossible to maintain it on the front. Only 2 of these tanks were made, and they never made it to the front during their entire existence. Not only Hitler suffered from megalomania, Stalin was no different. Therefore, in the USSR, a huge but pointless cannon was created. Anyone who has heard of counter-battery warfare understands that a cannon must be very mobile. Otherwise, after the first shot, a counterattack will follow. In this case, counter-battery fire wasn't even needed, as the cannon moved on rails. The enemy originally knew where to expect such a behemoth. But the funniest thing was not its huge size, weight, and reliance on railway tracks. This cannon could not turn. That is, it had to fire only in the direction of movement. To change the horizontal angle, special railway branches, called whiskers, were specifically built. The radius of their curvature was 0.3 miles. As a result, the enemy initially knew the firing point from these whiskers. Believe it or not, this cannon even participated in a real battle. It was during the Soviet-Finnish War, when the Soviet Union attacked Finland before the Great Patriotic War of 1941. 2 types of shells were used in this cannon. An armor-piercing and high-explosive shell weighing 1036 pounds and a long-range high-explosive shell weighing 692 pounds. The firing range was 18 miles. The barrel's resource was 400 shots. To increase the degree of madness, the story of bat bombers cannot be overlooked. This project was named Project X-Ray. Don't ask why it was named so. No one knows. The idea was as follows. Special cellulose containers with napalm were attached to bats. These mini-bombs were triggered after a set time. The point was that bats were to be dropped from an airplane, and they would scatter to attics of houses within a 12-mile radius. The goal was to cause a huge number of fires. At that time, no one differentiated between civilians and military personnel. They bombed everyone. Experiments showed that with the same bomb load, conventional incendiary bombs caused between 167 and 400 fire outbreaks. But bat bombs provided 3,000 to 4,000 fires. The program was closed only because they simply ran out of time to develop the details, and the dropping of atomic bombs completely closed the issue. During World War II, many different types of weapons and devices were invented. Some were unsuccessful, while others were very useful. One such development in Germany was the Goliath tracked mine, a crewless tankette controlled by wire at a distance. 3 types of these demolition tanks were used: the light Goliath, the medium Springer, and the heavy Borgward 4. The lightest version, Goliath, had dimensions of 150 weight and carried up to 220 pounds of explosives. This was enough to destroy tanks, infantry formations, and buildings. Initially, there were models on electric traction, but later they were made with a 12-horsepower gasoline engine. This weapon was first used on the front in 1943 and was used until the end of the war. An interesting fact. Everyone knows that the Nazis developed unusual flying devices during World War II, which are now called flying saucers. There are even genuine photos and videos of these saucers being tested. But if you try to dig deeper into this topic, you will encounter a huge amount of myths and very scant information. It seems that the topic of flying saucers is still alive, and secret services do not want the public to know much about it. Among the known facts, the Third Reich worked on the V7 project, which had the shape of a flying saucer. They also developed a separate project called Odin, in honor of the ancient Scandinavian god. The aim of this project was to develop devices with greater maneuverability than the most advanced fighters. The Odin 42M model reached speeds of up to 559 miles an hour. The development was led by engineer Victor Schauberger at a base in Antarctica. By the way, in response to skeptics, there are genuine photos of the Japanese who were helping the Germans with the developments. What were they doing in Antarctica in the 1940s? And today, when UFO witnesses talk about strange cases with a clear Japanese trace, they are only subjected to ridicule. It is also documented that the Germans had secret bases not only in Antarctica, but also in Germany itself, as well as in Czechia and Africa. Overall, the topic of flying saucers and monowing aircraft from World War II warrants a whole video. If you're interested in this, please write about it in the comments. Touching upon various developments of World War II, it's impossible to ignore nuclear developments. They could have radically changed the entire history of the world. In the Third Reich, the nuclear program had been developing since 1939. A letter from Professor Paul Hardek stated directly that the country that could master the achievements of nuclear physics would gain absolute superiority over other countries. Possibly, if the fascist government had not persecuted scientists and Jews, they might have completed the developments before the end of the war. To be fair, it's worth noting that the formal start of the nuclear program was in December 1938, when 2 German physicists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, were the first in the world to split the nucleus of a uranium atom. In total, there were 22 scientific organizations in Germany, directly associated with the atomic project. The project itself was called the Uranium Project. By February 1942, the first German reactor had been built, outpacing a similar development by Fermi in Chicago by 4 months. This experimental reactor belonged to the Leipzig Institute and was developed by Professor Heisenberg and the Doppel couple. Naturally, the Allies knew about the nuclear program, so they tried to hinder it in every possible way. For example, in February 1943, Norwegian saboteurs sent from Great Britain managed to destroy a heavy water production plant in Norway. Remember, Norway collaborated with Germany at that time. It's also important to note that the research in Germany received 200 times less funding and involved 1,500 times fewer people than the American nuclear project. By the way, the Americans not only completed the project, but also put a definitive end to World War II by dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan. During World War II, besides conventional submarines, various participating countries also used miniature submarines. They differed from their larger counterparts in cost, construction time, maneuverability, and stealth. They were used for sabotage operations, such as destroying enemy maritime objects and bases. Thanks to their compact size, they could approach enemy targets unnoticed, causing serious damage. Setting up underwater minefields, reconnaissance. They could stealthily approach enemy shores, gathering valuable information. Torpedo attacks. Understandably, a small submarine couldn't carry torpedoes with a large charge, but there were many sabotage operations where mini submarines had no alternatives. Few know that in World War II, the Germans extensively used horse-drawn transport, i.e., horses. Hitler gave clear instructions to show only mechanized transport in videos and photos. This was done to intimidate the enemy and boost the morale of the Germans themselves. Because of this, already in the 1930s, the world's first MLRS, multiple launch rocket system, was created in the form of a cart that could easily be harnessed to a horse. This weapon was called Nebelwerfer, meaning smoke thrower. Initially, it was designed as a chemical weapon for launching smoke and chemical charges. The Soviet Katyusha was also developed for these purposes. But fragmentation explosive shells proved their effectiveness on the battlefield. Therefore, both the Germans and Soviets abandoned the original idea. Later, the Germans improved their weapon and started installing it on self-propelled mounts. Vorframen 40 was a self-propelled MLRS that fired high-powered shells with a warhead weighing 110 pounds. MLRS from different countries demonstrated their effectiveness in destroying logistics, armored vehicles, and enemy personnel. This weapon, in various modifications, has survived to our days, continuing to show its effectiveness on the battlefield. The Japanese also made crazy things. A good example is the Fugo fire balloon. From late 1944 to early 1945, Japan launched over 9,300 such balloons towards America. Essentially, these were the forerunners of intercontinental missiles. The balloon was filled with hydrogen, and a barometric autopilot and bomb were installed on the gondola. It automatically monitored the balloon's altitude. The calculation was as follows. The balloon flew at an altitude of 6.8 miles, and after 72 hours, a timer activated the bomb drop. The Japanese calculated that by that time, the balloons should reach America. The only known victims of this bombardment were Eliza Mitchell, a pastor's wife, and 5 children aged 11 to 14. But this is official. Since the US authorities classified the information at the time of the attack to make the Japanese think they had failed, there were probably more serious consequences. But no one will tell you the truth. If this project had been really pointless, it would not have been used by the British against Germany, nor by the US in reconnaissance of strategic Soviet objects during the Cold War. Interestingly, in the 1950s, the US developed biological weapons based on such balloons. The goal was to deliver pests to cereal crops in case of a Third World War. That's all for now. Goodbye.